With an action node selected inside Connect Effects, you can access the parameters relevant to the action node down in the bottom of the UI. And you can see there are a lot of different parameters that you can access when working in the action tool. Along the left-hand side, you can see a series of buttons that allow us to access those different areas, such as the action bin, clicking media, I now have the media tab, the object tab, source, output, and analyzer. Looking in the schematic view, we know we have one layer currently coming into the action tool, which is our Paris graphic. Then we have the image of our city, then we have that going into a garbage mask, which then feeds into a color warper, and then that comes in as the background for our action tool. What I want to do is actually create another layer and feed this color warper in as a layer source instead of just the background. So with the action tool selected, I'll come down to the media tab, and right above our preview of the individual layers, there's a button that reads New Media. If I click on it and expand it, I can choose New Input. Immediately you'll see a new input has been added. Again, it's internal, it's empty right now. So I'll take the yellow output of the color warper and feed it into the red input for this new layer. I'm going to then click down and drag across the green connection line for the background, which in turn cuts it. Looking down at our media list, we now have two individual layers being fed into the action tool. Notice that when I select the Paris logo, you have a front and the matte. You can see the preview right over here on the left-hand side. That's because we have the individual front image and we have an individual matte image being fed into the red and the blue of this layer. But selecting the new layer we just created, you can see in the preview, all we have is a front. In the media list, we see it reads 2M for matte and it says internal. That's because we didn't feed anything into the matte input for that layer. Also, looking in the viewport, we can see we no longer see our graphic, the word Paris. That's because this new layer is in front of it. You can control the hierarchy of the layers by going to the priority editor, and that button is all the way over here in the lower left. I click on it, and here we can see the hierarchy of these individual layers. With the new top layer selected, I can click the push to back button, and now I have changed the order of my layers. I can click on the priority editor to close it. Now if we want to start cycling through and selecting different elements that are in the action tool, we need the action tool obviously to be selected. Then over here where it reads object, you're going to see exactly what is selected. And it says image 2 is currently selected. And then I have a set of arrows right after that. As I start to click on each one of those arrows, you'll notice the object that is selected is changing. Now it reads default camera. If I click again, now I have axis number 1 selected. I click again, I have image 1. So I can cycle through the different objects that are in the action tool and change what is currently selected. This method of selecting the different objects or elements inside of action is not the most efficient way to do it. To really understand what you are selecting and to also visually be able to see what you are selecting, I would like to step into the action tool. Because the action node itself has its own schematic. It's a different type of schematic than what Connect Effects is. Remember, Connect Effects is a node-based compositor, and this is a flow chart of how the different tools and elements are working before it goes back out to our timeline. The action tool, as I said, has a schematic, and in the action schematic, you can very easily select different elements. It also allows you to control how different elements relate to each other or interact with each other in the 3D space. So with this viewport, my Connect Effects schematic active, I'm going to access the viewing flyout, and you can see one of the options is called the action schematic. You can also use the escape key as a hotkey to step into the action schematic. I'll choose that, and now you'll see we stepped into the action tool. I'll zoom out by holding Control and Option, and you'll see we have a node for the camera, the default camera. I'll zoom back in, but this time I'll just choose Fit from the View Scale option. So as I was saying, we have a camera, and now each image that we had brought in as a layer has an image node, and then there's an axis that's applied to each one of those images. The axis is what we use to control the position, the rotation, the scaling, and so on of this image. And if I double click on the axis, its parameters will come available to me down at the bottom of the UI. And these parameters on the bottom will change depending upon what object or node I select inside the action schematic. So as we know, I have axis 2 selected, so we see the axis 2 parameters. And by default, when you have an axis selected and there's an image associated with it, the image parameters will be displayed over on the right-hand side. But watch what happens when I select my camera. Now the parameters down below switch to be the parameters relevant to the camera. Again, if I select axis 1, we're now looking at axis 1 over here on the left-hand side and image 1 over here on the right-hand side. You can also rename any element inside the action schematic. By selecting the object, such as axis number 1, I'll come down where we have the object field. Well, this object area where you see the name of the object is also the name field. So I can highlight it and then I can change what its name is. I'll add the word graphic to the name. So now you'll see the node itself, the name has been updated. The tab down below with the parameters has been updated. And I can do the same for the image. And we'll also do it for this image. So I select image 2. I'll just name this city. And I'll take my axis 2 and we'll do the same thing, underscore city. So now I've renamed the images and the axes of these different layers. Now when the action tool is selected, either in Connect Effects or like we are here where I'm actually in the action tool, you'll notice the top tab is the action bin. If I click on that to bring it forth, you'll see we have a bin filled with different tools. And there's different tabs for the different elements such as relighting, mapping, surface controls, object controls, or all nodes shows you everything. You can create custom bins and so on. Now we also know that we have our FX nodes over here. When I click on that, we now have all the original Connect Effects tools available to us. But when you are in the action tools, such as I am right now, these tools are not relevant. I cannot apply them to my different elements inside the action tool. These are only relevant in Connect Effects. For example, if I take a blur and start trying to drag it up, I get a warning. There is no Connect Effects schematic view available. So I'll go back and click FX nodes to hide them. So keep that in mind when you're in the action tool. These are the tools you use relevant to being in 3D, because that's what these are. These are all 3D relevant tools. So it might be a little confusing when you first start using Smoke, the difference between the action bin and its tools and the tools that are available to you in the effects node. A perfect example is a light. A light is a 3D object that you want to add into your 3D scene to relight the elements that you have, such as the word Paris or the background clip, the city. So down below we have a light tool. And just for reference, the hotkey to isolate specific tools inside your bin works also in the action bin as it does in the Connect Effects node. For example, I want to find my light. I know it starts with the letter L. I hit the L key on my keyboard with my cursor over the tool bin. You see now the tools that start with L are highlighted. The lens flare, the lens texture, and the light. I'll take the light, pick it up, drag it into my schematic, and release it. Now a light has been added and it has its own node. And then with the light selected, I can either go to the Object tab to access parameters, or let me go back to my action bin just for right now. If I want to access any parameters of any of the nodes, you double click on that node and then that node's parameters will be the currently selected parameters. And now if I select any node, obviously as we discussed earlier, the parameters will change for me. You can also just pick up the light inside the actual viewport, the icon for the light, and just move it around and position it wherever you want it to be. You'll notice my X and Y position fields are updating as I move this around. And of course you can just use the fields by clicking and dragging on them. What I'd like to do with this light is move it back toward my camera. So I'll take the Z position and I'll just drag it back like so. I can obviously expand and move my viewports around. And again, as I showed you, we can zoom back. You can see there's the light way back there. And if you've ever worked in a 3D application, very often you want to be looking at your 3D scene from different angles. Meaning, I want to look down on my scene. I want to look to the left. I want to look to the right. You can change what each one of these viewports is displaying by going to the view setting. So if I go to my flyout, which reads Action Schematic currently, I can go down to the option that says Action 3D Views. And then you have the default camera, which is actually what my other viewport is in right now. But then I also have the options of front, side, and top. And Shift 4 is your top. Shift 3 is the side view. Shift 2 is your front. But let's just choose top for right now. And then I'll zoom back and we can see there's our camera and there's our light. Again, I can just pick up the light and move it around. But as I said, I want it to be right over here near the camera. I'll hit the escape key with this viewport selected, which brings me back into my schematic view. And with the light selected, not only do you have position and rotation parameters, you've got the color of the light, the type of the light, the intensity, the spread, the fall off, and so on. So you have lots of controls of your lights. Not only do you have all this control over the light, you also can control what exactly is being affected by the light. And you do that with one of your tools. Right now, the light is going to affect everything in my action tool. If I go to my tools, which is right here, I click the flyout, you'll see a whole series of different tools. Some of these tools are tools about controlling your nodes. There's also tools about controlling things such as your mask, your control points, adding points, deleting points. There's also different viewport tools. And at the top, there are what I like to call relationship tools. One of them is called the Light Link tool. And you also have the hotkey of Shift L to access tool if you want. If I click on this though, and I bring my cursor into the viewport, you'll see the icon has changed. It's got a little light next to it. This tool allows me to click off of a light, such as this, and you'll see a blue line now appearing. Whenever I drop the blue line on, I'm going to make a connection and tell this light I want you to only affect this image of the city. So I do that, and immediately you see the graphic, the word Paris, goes black because there's no lights affecting it. I'll go back to my select tool, or I could have used Shift M to do that. I'll go back to the action bin, and now I'll take another light and drag this into the scene. So now there's a new light that just came in, and this light is affecting both the Paris graphic and the city. This way I can really control how I want these lights to affect the different elements. Again, I can just click on the icon in the viewport and move it around, but I'll double click on that light 2, to access its parameters. I'll take the spread and I'm going to start dragging the spread down, and suddenly you're going to see the cone shape appear once I get past a certain percentage. Now I can create a cone light effect. I'll take the Z position for this, move it back, maybe move it over here. I can rotate the light. So as you can see, you've got lots of different controls for your lights. And all the different elements that you add and create in the action tool will have a node displayed in its schematic. Remember, this is not a flowchart schematic like ConnectFX was. As I mentioned earlier, this is an easy way of accessing your elements and also a great way of controlling the relationships of different elements. So as we know, this light is only going to affect this graphic because of the connection I made. Now what if we wanted to go and add another axis to control both these elements at one time? Currently, I can select either one of them and I can rotate the axis, I can scale the axis, I can change the position through a calculator or clicking and dragging on the fields. But I want to control both at one time now. So to do that, I'll go to the action bin once again, and you'll see there's an axis tool right there. I'll pick it up, drag it into the schematic, and I just drop it. Right now, this is affecting nothing. It's just a transformation data that's being held in this axis tool, but nothing is being affected by it. You can click off the edge of an axis tool. Now you'll see a connection line. And if I draw that connection line and drop it on this axis, I just created a child-parent relationship. You can also create this relationship or connection by holding the Shift key down in the action schematic and kissing or touching two nodes. So this axis is now going to affect both layers. I can scale them up and down. I can position them together and so on. So I still have independent control of each of the images, each of the layers, because they have their own individual axis, and then there's the parent axis to affect both of them. Now each image that you bring in obviously has its own parameters you can adjust. I'll select the Paris image again, and first of all, under blending, we have our different blend types. I can switch this to be a screen, I can switch this to be a multiply. Also, just for reference, the default blending modes are what we know as the flame blend modes. If I click on this flyout, I can switch this to be the Photoshop blend modes. Now all the Photoshop blend modes that I'm familiar with from Photoshop are available to me. So I can multiply and so on. Then there's a transparency setting if we wanted to adjust this. Let me select Image 2 City. What I want to do with this now is actually bend it and manipulate it in 3D space. By default, the surface is flat, But if you expand the flyout, you get two more options. There's bilinear, which means I now have 4 corner points that I can go and manipulate. That's great for doing a 4 corner point track. I'll switch to extended by cubics. Now, not only do I get the corner points that I can manipulate, I get Bezier handles that allow me to bend my image. For example, I can region select all 4 of these Bezier controls. In this view then, I'm going to hit Shift 4, go to our top view, and now I'll grab one of the selected Bezier handles, and now I can bend and manipulate this image in 3D space. I'll hit the Escape key to go back to my schematic and make sure I have the axis for the city image selected. I can scale it up and move it in Z space to position it exactly where I want it to be. Now I'll activate this viewport, my default camera viewport. I want to turn on the border for this, a grid. So right underneath the viewport, you'll see where it reads grid. I'll click on that and I'll enable the image border. Now I can see a border of my image, my end result of my camera. You can also change the color of that if needed. I'll leave it as it is though. Now I want to take this light, this one that I've created over here, and I want to cast shadows from this so that there's a shadow of our graphic, the word Paris, falling on our background. So with light 2 selected, I'll first rename this. I'm going to name this shadow. So I know this is the one that's going to cast a shadow. With it selected then, I go to my action bin and I'll hit the S key to highlight all my tools that start with S, and there is a tool called a shadow cast. Now because the light is selected, if I just double click on this, it will add the shadow cast automatically to that light. And in our viewport, we now see the shadow being cast onto our backplate. Now as I select the light and start moving it around, you can see how interactive this movement is, and we can see the end result of the shadow changing as the light is moved. I'm going to select our Paris layer once again, and I'll switch its blend mode back to being normal, so it's easier to see the graphic inside the viewport. And I'll select our light once again, and I'll drag it back in Z space as so. Notice that with the light selected, because the shadow cast is attached to this, I get the shadow cast parameters. Here I can come in and soften the edge of my shadow. I can adjust the transparency of the shadow. I can change the color and so on. Now I'd like to create an animation of my camera. So with the camera selected, I want to make sure the auto key all the way over here on the right is on. You see the yellow highlight. Make sure that's on. I'm at the first frame. I'll take the XI parameter for the camera and just start to manipulate this. I'll position it somewhere around 400. And then I'll jump to the very last frame by clicking the Go to Last Frame button right here. And I'll take the X parameter and I'll take it into a negative 400. So now as I scrub through, you can see that we have an animation of the camera. Now I notice that my backplate is not staying in frame perfectly because of the camera's animation. So I'll select the axis once again for that layer and just scale it up a little more. And now as I scrub through, I can see that it does stay in exactly as I want it to be. But now that I'm looking at this, I'm thinking that I want the backplate to move with the camera. So I can do that with another tool. Go back to my tool bin, I'll select the Look At tool. And then when I click off of the axis, which is the main axis for my image to city layer, you'll see an orange line up here. I'll drop that on the camera, and immediately you'll notice that the layer snapped to be looking at the camera. I'll hit Shift and hit the M key to go back to my Select tool. And then in this viewport here, I'll hold Shift and hit the 4 key to then look down on the scene. So now as I scrub through, you can see that my camera has been animated and the backplate is always going to be looking at it because of the connection that I just made in the schematic view. I'll hit the Escape key once again to go back to the schematic view. Now I want to take the graphic layer, the word Paris, and move it a little closer to the camera. I'll take the Z position and move it forward. But now obviously because I've moved it forward and I didn't move this light forward, it's now affecting the word Paris a little different. So let me undo that by hitting Command Z. Then I'll click off the axis, which is the main axis for this graphic, the word Paris, and I'll drag it and drop it onto the light, the main light with the shadow. Now you can see the arrow, the direction of the arrow for the connection is telling me that this axis is now controlling that light. So now with that axis selected, I move forward. You'll notice the light is going to move with it. So hopefully now you understand exactly what the action schematic allows you to do. As you can see, it's an easy way of selecting any element inside your 3D scene. But more importantly, it gives you a visual representation of the elements in your 3D scene and the relationships between the different objects, whether it's a light and how it's affecting certain elements, whether it's an axis that is affecting multiple elements at one time, or whether it's an element such as this axis that is always going to be looking at the camera.